Hello. In this presentation, following on my previous one that focused on the standardization of Afrikaans, I am going to tell you about some trends in written Afrikaans since standardization that I call formalization and colloquialization. First, a bit of background information to contextualize the questions leading this presentation. Colloquialization refers to a trend which phases out markers of distance, respect, superiority, or inferiority, and aims at the expression of greater equality and familiarity, as defined by Leach and colleagues. So, in simple terms, what that means is that language use becomes increasingly informal and comfortable and familiar, and overt markers of distance and authority and such are used less and less. And that moves in the direction of greater equality and familiarity in the language use. And now Leach and colleagues says that it aims at certain things, but this is not something that necessarily happens on purpose. It can also very well be a subconscious development that just happens through certain social conventions and trends and things like that. So on the one hand, we have colloquialization. On the other hand, there is formalization. Now, in formalization, markers of distance and respect are used increasingly, and expression of equality and familiarity is avoided or at least not prioritized. So that is basically going in the opposite direction than colloquialization, where in the general language use, there is a deliberate inclusion of things like authority and distance and respect, and expression of equality and familiarity is, if not avoided, at least not prioritized. So, as you would know from my previous presentation, the standardization of Afrikaans gained momentum about a century ago. And what we often see with recently standardized languages is that some measure of formalization happens. So with establishing this language as a language of science and law and trade and whatever, there is a definite focus on this kind of language use that would also be more formal than the language use was previously. So we would expect to see formalization in Afrikaans in the early to mid 20th century. But then, as you would also know from my previous presentation, democracy was introduced to South Africa, full democracy, in the 1990s. And from there also developed a more inclusive view of Afrikaans. So with that and the expanding the standard with being more inclusive and things like that, but also then the use of electronic media, social media, that also encourages or at least creates an environment where informal language use is the norm. So in light of these events, late 20th, early 21st century, we would expect colloquialization to be present in Afrikaans language use. So that leads us to two questions that I will be answering, at least to some extent, regarding these trends that I mentioned. The first is, what trends in terms of formalization and colloquialization can be found in written Afrikaans, written standard Afrikaans, in the centuries since standardization commenced? So simply descriptive in terms of any trends of formalization and colloquialization. But secondly, also the question, what does this mean for linguists? What can we learn and what can we take away from this? Now, I just want to say at this point that there is a chapter in my book that focuses on discourse and societal changes, and in that chapter is a section on this specifically. I present the data and results in a slightly different way there, but you are welcome, and I expand more. So here I'm looking at some of the core variables that I investigated for this purpose, but you are welcome to look at that chapter of mine to see a more detailed investigation of the whole thing of formalization and colloquialization. Okay, now to judge the quality of whatever it is I will present to you, you would need to know how I obtained the results that I will be presenting to you. My method is corpus linguistics. So a while back, I compiled a corpus of written Afrikaans, referred to usually as the historical corpus of standard Afrikaans, that spans a century from 1911 to 2010. And it has 4 corpora or periods represented. So the first one is 1911 to 20, then 1941 to 50, 1971 to 80, and 2001 to 2010. And each of these periods has more or less 260,000 words, but not the first. And there's a very specific reason for that. In the pie chart here on the right, you'd be able to see the composition of the corpora. So that's for each of these corpora. That is the composition of different text types included in the corpus. So there's a scientific section with humanities and natural sciences. So different disciplines were divided broadly into these two groups. There's a large fiction section, and then also a non-fiction section with a fairly small biographical, religious, and news report component, but a larger informative component. So it's informational texts of many different kinds, which is why it's a larger section. And then just to have some unedited, spontaneous written language represented at all, there's also a small manuscript section where letters of different kinds and diary entries were included. Now, what happened was, in the 1910s, so Corpus 1, it was somewhat challenging to collect data in terms of deciding whether something is more Afrikaans or still more Dutch. So the point of the corpus is to represent Afrikaans, and specifically standard written Afrikaans, um, when a text was a little too Dutch in different ways. So in terms of word choice, spelling, and different kinds of things, I would exclude it from the corpus. Now, for the fiction and non-fiction and even manuscript sections, it wasn't too difficult to find sufficient texts to include. The letters and diaries are fairly well preserved in archives. So we have the National Archives with repositories in Pretoria and Cape Town, where there are impressive collections of letters from very early on in the colonial days up until fairly recently. And then also the National Library of South Africa in Cape Town has a collections of letters, some universities, and so on. So those were not particularly difficult to obtain, but the scientific section was a bit more challenging, because we know that scientific writing is particularly formal and standard and slower to adopt new linguistic norms. So what happened was, with the humanities section, I did manage to fill the corpus, the section, with the number of texts and words that I needed, but it was a little biased towards matters pertaining to Afrikaans as a language. The reason for that is that the majority of people working in research kinds of things on Afrikaans, in Afrikaans, were working also on Afrikaans. So it does make sense in that way. So most of those texts in the humanities section are from 1915 onwards, and a large proportion of those focus on Afrikaans as a topic. Now, usually with corpus compilation, you would vary the topics of the different texts, but it was simply not possible for the humanities section because there were a very limited amount of texts available. With the natural sciences, there was an even greater issue, because natural scientists at that point, so up until 1920, simply did not write in Afrikaans. They either wrote in Dutch or in English. In the end, I found two textbooks, science textbooks aimed at university students, which I deemed as sufficiently scientific to fall into this category. And as an emergency measure, where I would usually not take more than approximately 2,000 words from a single text, I took 5,000 words from each of these books, because it's after extensive searches in archives and libraries all over the country, it was simply the only Afrikaans natural science texts in that period that I could find. So I took 5,000 words from each to have at least 10,000, and that is why you would see that the corpus size of Corpus 1 is different. But rest assured that for everything that I report, the numbers are normalized, so that the smaller corpus size does not skew the numbers from Corpus 1. So I just wanted you to note that there is something fishy going on with Corpus 1, indeed. But in terms of the results that I present you from here on, it is normalized numbers that means you can directly compare the numbers from the different corpora. Okay, so let's have a look at the formal and informal variants that I identified and analyzed to eventually determine whether there are any trends of formalization and colloquialization and what those trends entail. So the first variant I'm looking at here is a formal one, as you can deduce from the title of the slide, formal second person pronoun I. So this is a kind of honorific address of someone in the second person, and it can be used for an individual of any gender, and it can be used for plural as well. So you will see here in the first example, wanneer wil u met die werk begin, meneer de Pre, where u is used to refer to a specific person, Mr. de Pre. In the second example, you can see that die uurwerk wat u hier sien, dames en here, so he refers to the group, ladies and gentlemen, and he uses the pronoun u as well. So you can see here that it's not marked for gender or number, but it is very specifically very formal. A research article that was published a few years ago investigated people's attitudes toward u, and they found that especially the younger generations find it very overly formal and stiff and archaic. And even older people generally, while they appreciate when someone addresses them that way, it isn't something they necessarily expect, and they also regard it as quite formal, quite a formal way of addressing someone. So what you can see in the graph here is that the use of e as second person pronoun declines throughout the century represented by the corpus data. So the informal equivalent of u is jy and jou for the singular and julle for the plural. So one would assume that while u is on the decline very clearly and consistently, we would expect to see the use of the other forms increase at the same time. So we will get to that a bit later. But yes, even though I mentioned that one would expect some upwards and some downwards trends, what we see here for E specific is that it's just simply declining. And at this point, the research I mentioned just now also attested that it is used very infrequently in general. Okay, so the next variant is also a formal one, and it would not surprise you that the passive construction is regarded as fairly formal. So what I illustrate here in the two examples, the first is a passive sentence in the present tense. So you would have the use of the auxiliary word. Now, what's interesting is that word is also used as a copular verb, and then a main verb that is a resultative. But in a passive sentence, it's used as an auxiliary. So this is the auxiliary verb, the passive auxiliary verb, similar to what would be in English is done, or something is done, is being done, or something like that. And then in the second sentence, it's in the past tense. So there you have is, and again, is usually or more frequently copular, and it is the most frequently used one, similar to English is, but different from English. Afrikaans only has one invariable form in terms of number, so there isn't a distinction between singular and plural like there is for English is and are, although it is one of exactly two verbs, the copular is, that has a separate infinitive, but that is luckily not important here because we are focusing on the passive use. And so is the present tense of the copular verb, but when used as a passive auxiliary, it signifies a past tense passive construction. Now, I'm assuming that you would agree that the use of a passive is regarded as formal because it exactly, or at least in terms of the formalization and colloquialization, it exactly creates distance, and it is impersonal, especially when it's used as to avoid specifying the actor in a specific verbal construction. So yes, that is, it's also something that you find more frequently in traditionally formal texts, so texts regarded as formal, such as academic writing. So yes, let's look at the trends of the use of the passive construction. So what we find here is that from the 1910s onward, so 1940s and 70s, the use of the passive construction or passive constructions increase throughout. And that corresponds to our suspicion that formal variants would increase at first, early in the century, and then possibly decrease later, which is what we see here as well. So different from the E that we would have to account for in some way, here we have a more expected pattern of increase at first and then decline. The next variable is actually a set of variables, and that is the genitive constructions in Afrikaans. Now, it's slightly more complicated than just distinguishing between an informal and a formal variant, but the one variant, se, is still less formal than fun. So the se has a whole history of development from Dutch, but it is basically used as a genitive particle, where the possessor precedes the particle and then the possessum follows after. The other variant is fun, is very similar to English of genitive, and it is uh, inherited directly from Dutch, so it's not strange in that regard. And with the fun genitive, the possessor follows the fun, and the possessum precedes it. Now, there are a number of genitive expressions and meanings that can only be expressed by fun. So obviously, if I want to look comparatively, I have to take those out of the equation. So when I refer here to the se and the fun, I only included those that are in principle interchangeable. So can either of these can be used and the sentence will still make sense and be grammatical. So, like I said, it's a bit more complicated than just formal and informal because the se is shorter. So the construction, the se construction is shorter because there's also a definite article in the fun equivalent that has to be included. So the point is that it's not as simple as a formality distinction, but there is a formality distinction. So I did want to include it in the data set of looking at formalization and colloquialization because it could at least potentially provide some insights. So here we can have a look at se and fun. So on the one hand, the se is increasing slowly but steadily throughout the century. So what we have there is similar to the pattern with E, but in the reverse. And chances are that what is more relevant here in terms of the increase of se is its grammaticalization, its ongoing grammaticalization. And I have written a few things on this that you can look at if you are interested. But the point is that the increase there is probably, especially the consistent increase, is probably not about formality in the first place. But with fun, it seems a little different because it is, in the written language at least, still the default, used much more frequently than se, at least in the earlier part of the century. But then you can see that initially its use still increases along with that of se. So clearly there's more going on there than just se increasing and fun declining, because these are the equivalent uses. So that is more likely to resemble other trends such as formalization and then later on colloquialization. So the primary point here is that the increasing use of fun between the 1910s and 1940s is significant, and in terms of its equivalent use of se, unexpected, and that could be significant for formalization after initial standardization. Next, we turn to determiners. So we have the demonstratives di and hiri. Now, just a moment's background about Afrikaans demonstratives. The di is inherited from Dutch, And technically, it is not specified for distance. So it can refer to something proximate and something distant. But the other Dutch demonstratives, such as deze, was lost in the development of Afrikaans. So in order to distinguish between proximate and distant references, a new set of demonstratives developed. So you have the D from the older Dutch, but then adjacent to it is either hier, which translates to here, or daar, which translates to there. So loosely, hierdie would translate to hear this or hear these, and daardie would translate to there this or there these. So, and in terms of meaning, it's equivalent to these, this or and these or those. That refers to more distant matters. So, the reason D, the one unspecified for distance, and hiri is taken here as informal and formal variants of the same thing is that D is used for proximate reference much more frequently than it is used for reference to distant things and matters and whatever. And that is probably simply because as humans, we tend to talk about things that are close to us. Well, we tend to talk about ourselves, but then also about things that are close to us. And in that regard, it makes sense that even though it's not specified for proximity, it is more often than not used for proximate reference. So that is the context in which I take the D as informal and the hiri as formal. What we see here in the graph is quite an interesting pattern. For D, the informal variant, there is an initial decline, which would correspond to formalization, and then increase from the 1940s throughout the rest of the corpora. What's unusual is the very, very sharp increase of hiri from the 1910s to the 1940s. Now, what explains this is that hiri and dari were very recent developments in Afrikaans, and in the early 20th century, it was still being adopted by speakers more widely, and its use was not yet very established. So the increase between the 1910s and the 1940s is primarily due to the new variant being adopted. And it is confirmed by the fact that the same happened with Dari. Now, for all kinds of reasons, Dari isn't included here, but I can report that the trend in the use of Dari is similar, with a steep increase between 1910s and 40s, and then a slow but steady decline from there on further. So, although the increase initially is not only because of formalization, the decline from the 1940s onward could actually be representative of colloquialization. Now for the next variable, we return to pronouns, and you might remember that when doing the first one, the formal second person I, I referred to the informal ya and yo. So this is the singular second person. So that is the informal equivalent of I. Now, the reason I didn't include julle is because the plural isn't regarded as informal to the same extent that jy and yo is. What further complicates the picture is that in Afrikaans general language use, the use of jy and yo is avoided by many people when referring to someone that is significantly older than you are. But I is seen as very formal. So, to avoid I, but also avoid jy and yo, what people tend to do is repeat a form of address. And that could be a more formal form of address, such as doctor or professor, or reverend, or anything like that. But if someone doesn't have a title like that, you would basically call them aunt or uncle as a form of respectful address. And instead of saying, addressing them as aunt or uncle, and then just using ya and yo, you would repeat that form of address. So it's a very lengthy and cumbersome way of speaking, but it is still widely used by people who want to respectfully address their elders. So in that way, because there is this alternative to I that is still respectful, but not as formal as I, ya and yo is marked very clearly for informality. So there is that. But also, there is the practice of using ya and yo as a more generic pronoun, so not referring to a specific person, but just people in general. Like the second example, the person says that you feel like a great fool when you finish college. And similarly to the English example here, that you is used generically, so to refer to any person who would fit into that criteria. But that is also still informal, even though it's not addressing a person directly. So we have jy, the subject form, and yo, the object form, and tracing the use of these would indicate, might indicate something about formality and informality. So what we can see here in the graph is that contrary to I, that declined steadily in the course of the century, ya and yo increases. So in a way, it is the mirror image of I, except for the clear jump from Corpus 3 to Corpus 4, so from the 1970s to the 2000s. Because the increase there is more significant, sharper and more significant, also statistically, than between the previous corpora, and it's also more significant and a lot sharper than the decline of E. So, what we probably have here is that there is something else going on with the increase of yay and yo. And that could include colloquialization from the 1970s to the 2000s. Sticking to pronouns, we now move on to the first person pronouns, ek, in May. So ek is the subject form and may is the object form. Now, you might be asking, why is this informal if we don't have a formal equivalent like with I and yay? It's just ek and may. There isn't an alternative that would signify formality. But as with the passive construction, referring to yourself in the first person explicitly is regarded as a characteristic of more informal language use. That is one of the reasons that I don't know about other languages, but in Afrikaans, we teach the undergraduate students when they write assignments and papers to rather avoid explicitly referring to themselves, but using the passive to avoid this reference. So it is in that way, possibly it links to the passive, but it's also more than that, because when referring to yourself, when talking about yourself, it is also simply often in informal contexts where topics would revolve around speakers themselves. So again, with caution, we can just see what the singular first person does in the course of the century. In this graph, you can see the inverted version of the usage pattern of the passive voice, incidentally, where initially there is a clear drop in usage frequency. So between the 1910s and the 1940s, in writing, people refer to themselves directly less frequently. But then after that, this self-reference with the first person pronoun increases at least a little bit between the 1940s and 70s, and even a bit less, but still some between the last two corpora. So what we could have here is formalization between corpus 1 and 2, and then colloquialization from the 1940s onwards. Similarly to the singular first person pronoun, we also have the plural first person pronoun, ons, and it is invariable whether used in the subject or the object position of a sentence. Now, in the same way that referring to yourself is deemed informal for the singular first person. What is also particular about the plural is that you possibly include the speaker, which would also signal familiarity in a way. So for that reason, ons as first person plural pronoun can also be seen as an informal or characteristic of less formal language use. What you see here in the graph is that there's quite the decline in the use of ons from the first corpus to the second one, and still some decline between the second and the third. But then the use picks up again towards the last corpus, which means that it is used more, people are more comfortable using it in written language. So this could indicate formalization at first, and then for that last stretch, there might be colloquialization going on. And now for the last set of variables. Okay, I'll try to keep it simple. I refer to it here as adverbs and conjunctions. Its use is multifaceted. These three lexical items specifically. It is used as discourse markers that might indicate a number of things. It can be used as adverbs of time, like purely temporal adverbs. It's also used as conjunctions with a temporal meaning. So you can deduce that it might be used fairly frequently and in a number of related contexts. The reason these are regarded as informal is, apart from the fact that they are used as discourse markers, which tends towards more informal language, they are short words with very general meanings. So no is now, done is then, and do is then, but it has it's slightly more complicated than just simply then, obviously, because it's not the same as done. And for the temporal meanings, there are many more specific, descriptive, and more formal alternatives that one could use if you wanted to be more formal in your language use. And for the use of as conjunctions as well. So even for the uses of as adverbs. So the fact that they are short and very general, when they are chosen, it is more informal than alternative, more specific and descriptive alternatives. So let's see what they do. Okay, so what you can see here is for that there are similar but not exactly the same patterns of use of these three adverbs. So all of them drop quite significantly from corpus 1 to corpus 2. Then from 2 to 3, to and no remain more or less stable. So there isn't any visible change in frequency with to and no, but there is with done. So that one continues to decline. Between corpus 3 and 4, done still declines. No also declines again. So after being stable, it declines again. And 2, for some reason, increases a bit. So what we have probably here is clear formalization between the first and second corpus, so between the 1910s and 40s. Some possible more formalization after that, and then maybe a bit of informal colloquialization going on, although it's not clear because it's only 2 that is increasing again. But we will see. So next up, I'm going to look at summary findings, putting together some of the graphs of the different variables. Let's first look at the formal variants. So we have U, van, hierdie, and passives. Now, apart from U, that just declines throughout, we do see a pattern with the rest, where there is an increase in the remaining 3 between the 1910s and 40s. And between the 40s and 70s, it can kind of go either way. For some, there is still an increase that would denote formalization. With some, there is a bit of a decrease. So what that would suggest is that the differences between corpus 3 and corpus 4 are not particularly significant or important because it can kind of go either way. But then from corpus 3 to 4, there is a decline in all of these. Now we know that for E, you can't take that as at face value, but for the other 3 at least, that increased at some point in the past, decreasing again would suggest a pattern of colloquialization. So let's see what the informal variants tell us. So what do we have here? The first 2 here on the right, se and the singular second person jy and yo, are not very well behaved in the sense that they increase throughout the century. But we know that at least for se, it's probably due to grammaticalization, and we're not exactly sure what's going on with ya and yo, but we just keep it in mind. The remaining 4 variables, die, the first person pronouns and the adverbs / conjunctions, all decline from corpus 1 to corpus 2. So that corresponds with the increase in the formal variants, signifying formalization. Similarly to the formal variants, between corpus 2 and corpus 3, there's chaos going in any direction. But for most of these, the difference between corpus 3 and corpus 4 also aren't very big. So we take whatever happens there with a bit of salt, and we look at the differences between corpus 3 and 4. Now here, apart from to know and done when put together, but you would remember that it's also slightly more complicated if you look at them individually. But put together, they still decline, but the others all increase. And apart from S, that remains more or less stable in its increase, Jy, Jou, that did increase throughout the century, there is a much more significant and sharp increase between corpus 3 and 4. And then for the others, there is also an increase, whether it increased or decreased between corpus 2 and 3, it increases between corpus 3 and 4. So, what can we find in the end when putting all of this really messy data together? Because let's be honest, linguistic data is always messy. So we make do with what we have. The one clear trend is that of formalization between corpus 1 and 2. And that is what we would expect after initial standardization and the acceptance of the new written standard. So that in terms of the socio-cultural environment in which the language is used, formalization shortly after standardization is a very normal and expected development. Then we know that what goes on between 2 and 3 is messy and contradictory, and we can't do all that much with it. But between corpus 3 and 4, so from the 70s to the 2000s, we see a fairly clear trend of colloquialization. And again, given the newly established democracy and all of the other things going on that I mentioned in my first presentation, that is not surprising. So, again, the trend here in the language use corresponds with what is going on in the language external environment, socially and culturally. So that was my first question of the questions initially posed. The second one is, what does this mean for linguists? So, generally speaking, formalization and colloquialization can have an influence on the rise or decline of any specific variable in language use. And this can significantly affect grammatical categories. So yes, it is a language external factor to keep in mind, but it can influence language use to the extent that it can either enhance or diminish ongoing grammatical changes. It can propel a change that was only there in potential to actually continue. There are a number of things that can happen when the language external environment changes to any significant extent. You can see Collins, that source there for a reflection on this. And in the chapter in my book that I mentioned where I looked at the formalization and colloquialization, I also have a section on declining sexism in language use that confirms this notion that external factors can have a really significant influence on the grammar of a language. So that brings me to the second point there. This can bring about more systematic grammatical changes. So We do need to attend to genre norms and text types when we look at textual evidence of language change. Taking note of text types and genre norms at the time is important, because we also need to be able to distinguish between the language external norms and how these change, and the grammar of the language and how that changes. So this is something to keep in mind whenever we analyze language in use, because it can never be separated from the context in which it is used. Then just a last note, hoping that others would learn from my mistake. When I initially started looking at this kind of thing, I started with the adverb trio that I mentioned, the to, know, and done. And as you saw in the summary slide of the informal variants, when put together, these consistently these have a consistent pattern of decline throughout the century. Similarly, I then looked at a collection of more formal and specific alternatives, and these showed, when put together, the mirror image of to, know, and done by increasing throughout the century. And, you know, especially since it matched so nicely and neatly, I ran with it, and I published an article in which I claimed that, you know, the trend of formalization has been going on, and it's happening. It happened throughout the 20th century into the 21st century, because that is what my data told me. But when looking at language external influences, it's important to not only look at one variable or one group of variables or variants. Because you saw that with E, the second person pronouns, E, ya, yo, there is something similar going on. So the pattern remains consistent. With S, same thing. So because we are working with language, there are also, at least possibly, other language internal things going on that also influences linguistic choices that speakers make. So when you want to make claims about the influence of language external factors in language change and language use, it is incredibly important to test this with a number of different variants or variables, so that you can confirm that it's not just by accident that there is a consistent pattern with this one thing, and ensure that you look at sufficiently different kinds of things that show the same pattern for you to be confident in your conclusion, and not have to report like I had to, that you know, actually I said this in that thing, but actually I was not correct. I know better now. I mean, it does happen. It's good to repent if it comes down to it. It's not a shame to be wrong about something if you did the best you could with what you had. But being careful with this specifically is something that I would very strongly recommend. Again, if you have any questions or comments or want to know more, please let me know. I have lots of information. I've done research on this myself. There are other people who also contributed. So if you just want to ask a few questions, if you want some more reading, or just have a comment or two about something interesting, please do let me know. I would love to hear from you. And now finally, I am done. This is it. This is me and the conclusion of my 2 presentations. Thank you for listening through all of that, or I hope you did. If you did, thank you. If you didn't, I understand and I don't judge. But thank you for listening up to this point. And I hope that it was interesting and enriching for you to listen to.